The honourable member for South Surrey, White Rock.
Well, thank you, Madam Speaker. I rise virtually to debate Bill C-14, an act seeking to legislate elements of the Liberal government's long-awaited fiscal update announced last fall. I would like to mention that it is my granddaughter Avery Chapman's first birthday today, and I care very much about the Canada she is inheriting as she goes from walking to running to embracing her future. As proud Canadians, let's first consider where we are and how we got here. For the past 5 years, the Liberal government has opened Canada's pocketbook, running up our national debt to historic levels. Despite revenues being at an all-time high because of the strong fiscal foundation left by the previous Conservative government, year after year, the Liberals ran deficit after deficit. Deficits of $19 billion in 2016, another $19 billion in 2017, $14 billion in 2018, and $26 billion in 2019. Liberal campaign promises in 2015 of a balanced budget and a $1 billion surplus have been dropped entirely from the Trudeau Liberals' vocabulary. The Liberals spent so freely before the pandemic that instead of being prepared—
I remind the honourable member to not refer to names about current members of parliament, please.
I didn't know I did that. I apologize. Instead of being prepared for the possibility of economic downturn, and economies are always cyclical, the cupboards were bare long before the first case of COVID-19 was known. The pandemic has demanded more spending, but should also demand transparency and explanations as spending priorities are rolled out, workable solutions that benefit the most needy and support the survival of Canadian small businesses, new and established, should be at the top of the list. The Liberal government racked up a $381 billion deficit in 2020. This deficit equaled 17% of our GDP, which made for a higher debt to GDP ratio than we realized in World War I, the Great Depression, or the Great Recession. With the addition of this $381 billion deficit to our balance sheet, our national debt recently surpassed a tragic milestone, a debt of $1 trillion, a first for Canada. That's 1,000 billion for those counting. This all from the party whose leader famously stated the budget will balance itself. While these numbers may seem too big to comprehend, let me speak plainly. This is money that we, the taxpayers of Canada, collectively owe. It is debt that accrues interest each and every day. It is money that you and I have an obligation to repay, that our children will be on the hook for, and in all likelihood that our children's children, like one-year-old Avery, will be paying off decades from now. Is this to be our legacy? We can do better, and we must do better. What does all this debt really mean for Canadians? It is not just a number on a balance sheet somewhere. It means that Canadians could face higher taxes to pay down the debt and its interest, taxes that could further stifle the economy. It means the social supports and programs that many Canadians rely on could falter. It means that we could face another economic crisis with decreases in the value of homes, a declining stock market, loss of people's savings, reduced pension values, and the rise in unemployment lasting far longer than was necessary. I hope members on both sides of the aisle recognize the human toll that another financial crisis would have on mental health, substance abuse, depression, domestic violence, and homelessness. These are tragedies unfolding around us that have already increased at alarming rates this past year, issues that my constituents and I feel deeply about, issues that we are already studying in the Justice Committee, of which I'm a member. That takes me to where we are. Finally, at the end of 2020, after months of calls from our side of the House for a comprehensive budget to show Canadians where their tax dollars and all this debt finance spending is being spent, the Liberals gave Canadians a budget light, a budget really light, called their fiscal update. That fiscal update included a proposed $25 billion in new spending measures and a $100 billion stimulus plan, but again, few details about how the money would be spent or how and when it would be paid for. The day after it was presented in the House of Commons, the Deputy Minister of Finance, the highest ranking bureaucrat in the government's finance ministry, abruptly announced his resignation. Add this to the growing list of high-profile resignations under this government, which now includes Julie Payette, the Governor General, Bill Morneau, who was Minister of Finance, Jane Philpott, who was President of the Treasury Board, the member for Vancouver Granville, who served as Minister of Justice and Attorney General, Michael Wernick, Clerk of the Privy Council, Gerald Butts, the Prime Minister's Principal Secretary, and the member for Mississauga-Malton, who served as Minister of Innovation, Science and Industry. To replace the Deputy Minister of Finance, the Liberals appointed Michael Sabia, an architect behind the GST, introduced in the 90s, a tax that was lowered by the Harper-led government thanks to sound financial management. Does Mr. Sabia's appointment signal to Canadians that the Liberals plan to raise taxes? Will this government really start taxing the equity in Canadian home ownership, as widely reported? Only time will tell. One thing I know for certain as an MP and the former Minister of National Revenue, the lack of a federal budget is simply unacceptable. The budget isn't just a planning tool for government. It is the means by which the government announces in detail to Canadians from coast to coast to coast what it plans to do with billions of hard-earned taxpayers' dollars. According to the government's own website, quote, the budget is a blueprint for how the government wants to set the annual economic agenda for Canada, and it's the job of the Department of Finance to prepare it, end quote. The last federal budget was presented on March 19th, 2019, 686 days ago. So much for an annual budget, so much for promised transparency. As for some of the specifics Canadians were given, the most troubling part of the bill before us is the amendment it proposes to the Borrowing Authority Act. This amendment seeks to increase the government's maximum borrowing authority from $1.1 trillion to $1.8 trillion, a new maximum limit on the nation's credit card. This sets another record, the biggest increase in borrowing authority ever sought in our nation's history. Let that sink in for a moment, more than in World War II or past global recessions. At this point, why should Canadians trust this government? We've all seen the headlines. CRA admits unclear CERB communication led to mistaken applications. CERB repayment frustration continues. More than $636 million in CERB benefits paid to 300,000 teens aged 15 to 17, documents show. Troubled pandemic rent subsidy program expires today and there's no replacement ready. Exclusive golf course books $1 million surplus aided by federal COVID-19 relief, and $150 million to SNC-Lavalin. Really? SNC-Lavalin, mired in scandal and ethical challenges? Conservatives want to help Canadians make ends meet and recognize that the virus has affected millions of Canadians in a variety of ways, my family included. I know far too many constituents who've been laid off in the hospitality sector, tourism industry, retail businesses. I've heard from countless South Surrey White Rock businesses that they're struggling to keep their doors open. Our once bustling restaurant and shopping scene throughout the riding, including many shops along our picturesque White Rock Pier, are enduring catastrophic drops in patronage and revenue. And that's just the tip of the iceberg. Our airline industry that employs many in my riding is hemorrhaging. Of course, I'm in favor of the emergency response benefit, the wage subsidy, and the emergency business account. But we need to ensure these programs are rolled out right, that funds are timely, spent effectively, and spent in Canada to help Canadians. We need to ensure that through these billions of dollars in spending, no Canadian is left behind. So far, that is not what we've seen. There's many new businesses in my community whose investments were all made before the pandemic hit that aren't eligible for current subsidy programs because they opened their doors after March of 2020. Who's looking out for them? Given the astronomical size of our country's debt, we really can't afford to get this recovery wrong. We need to spend, but spend responsibly. We need transparency, and we need a true comprehensive budget. More than anything, Madam Speaker. We need to get Canadians back to work and a clear roadmap to recovery. Thank you, Madam Speaker.